Arthur discovered, to his embarrassment, that he was lying curled up in a small ball on the floor with his arms wrapped around his head. He smiled weakly. "It's a charming man," he said. "I wish I had a daughter so I could forbid her to marry." "Oh, you wouldn't need to," said Ford. "They've got as much sex appeal as a road accident." "Don't move," he said as Arthur began to uncurl himself. "You'd better be prepared for the jump into hyperspace. It's unpleasantly like being drunk." "What's so unpleasant about being drunk?" "Ask a glass of water." Arthur thought about this. "Ford," he said, "what's this fish doing in my ear?" "It's translating for you. It's a babblefish. Look it up in a book if you'd like." He tossed over The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and then curled himself up into a fetal ball to prepare himself for the jump. At that moment, the bottom fell out of Arthur's mind. His eyes turned inside out. His feet began to leak out of the top of his head. The room folded flat around him, spun around, shifted out of existence, and then left him sliding into his own navel. They were passing through hyperspace. "The babblefish," said The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy quietly, "is small, yellow, leech-like, and probably the oddest thing in the universe. It feeds on brainwave energy received not from its own carrier, but from those around it. It absorbs all unconscious mental frequencies from this brainwave energy to nourish itself with. It then excretes into the mind of its carrier a telepathic matrix formed by combining the conscious thought frequencies with nerve signals picked up from the speech centers of the brain which has supplied them. The practical upshoot of all this is that if you stick a babblefish in your ear, you can instantly understand anything said to you in any form of language. The speech patterns you actually hear decode the brainwave matrix which has been fed into your mind by your babblefish. Now, it is a bizarrely improbable coincidence that anything so mind-bogglingly useful could have evolved purely by chance that some thinkers have chosen to see it as a final and clinching proof of the non-existence of God. This argument goes something like this. "I refuse to prove that I exist," says God, "for proof denies faith, and without faith I am nothing." "But," says man, "the babblefish is a dead giveaway, isn't it? It could not have evolved by chance. It proves you exist, and so therefore your own arguments that you don't. QED. "Oh dear," says God, "I hadn't thought of that," and promptly vanishes in a puff of logic. "Oh, that was easy," says man, and for an encore he goes on to prove that black is white and gets himself killed on the next pedestrian crossing. Most leading theologians claim that this argument is a load of dingo's kidneys, but that didn't stop Ulan Kolafid from making a small fortune when he used it as the central theme of his best-selling book. Well, that about wraps it up for God. Meanwhile, the poor babblefish, by effectively removing all barriers to communication between different races and cultures, has caused more and bloodier wars than anything else in the history of creation. Arthur let out a small groan. He was horrified to discover that the kick through hyperspace hadn't killed him. He was now 6 light years from the place that the Earth would have been if it still existed. The Earth. Visions of it swam sickeningly through his nauseated mind. There was no way his imagination could feel the impact of the whole Earth having gone. It was too big. He prodded his feelings by thinking that his parents and sister had gone. No reaction. He thought of all the people he had been close to. No reaction. Then he thought of a complete stranger that he'd been standing behind in the queue in the supermarket 2 days ago, and he felt a sudden stab. The supermarket was gone. everyone in it was gone. Nelson's column was gone, and there would be no outcry because there would be no one left to make an outcry. From now on, Nelson's column only existed in his mind. England only existed in his mind. His mind stuck here in this dank, smelly, steel-lined spaceship. A wave of claustrophobia closed in on him. England no longer existed. He got that. Somehow he'd got it. He tried again. America, he thought, gone. Couldn't grasp it. Decided to start smaller again. New York was gone. No reaction. He never seriously believed it existed anyway. The dollar, he thought, has sunk forever. Slight tremor there. Every Bogart movie has been wiped, he said to himself, and that gave him a nasty knock. McDonald's, he thought. There is no longer any such thing as a McDonald's hamburger. He passed out. When he came round a second later, he found that he was sobbing for his mother. He jerked himself violently to his feet. Ford! Ford looked up from where he was sitting in a corner, humming to himself. He always found the actual traveling through space part of space travel rather trying. Yeah? He said. If you're a researcher on this book thing and you were on Earth, then you must have been gathering material on it. Well, I was able to extend the original entry a bit, yeah. Let me see what it says in this edition, then. I've got to see it. Oh, yeah, okay. He passed it over again. Arthur grabbed hold of it, and he tried to stop his hands from shaking. He pressed the entry for the relevant page. The screen flashed and swirled and resolved into a page of print. Arthur stared at it. It doesn't have an entry, he burst out. Ford looked over his shoulder. Yes, it does, he said. Down there, see at the bottom of the screen? Just above Eccentrica Golumbus, the triple-breasted whore of Erecticon 3. Arthur followed Ford's finger and saw where it was pointing. For a moment it didn't register, and then his mind nearly blew up. What? Harmless? That's all it's got to say? Harmless? One word? Ford shrugged. I mean, there are 100 billion stars in the galaxy and only a limited amount of space in the book's microprocessors, he said. And no one knew much about the Earth, of course. Well, for God's sake, I hope you managed to rectify that a bit. Oh, yes, well, I managed to transmit a new entry off to the editor. He had to trim a bit, but it's still an improvement. What does it say now? Asked Arthur. Mostly harmless, admitted Ford with a slightly embarrassed cough. Mostly harmless? Shouted Arthur. What was that noise? Hissed Ford. It was me shouting, shouted Arthur. No, shut up. I think we're in trouble. You think we're in trouble? Outside the door were the clear sounds of marching footsteps. The Dentrosis? Whispered Arthur. No, those are steel-tipped boots, said Ford. There was a sharp, ringing rap on the door. Well, then, who is it? Said Arthur. Well, said Ford, if we're lucky, it's just the Vogons come to throw us into space. And if we're unlucky? If we're unlucky, said Ford grimly, the captain might be serious in his threat that he's going to read us some of his poetry first. Chapter 7. Vogon poetry is, of course, the third worst in the universe. The second worst is of the Asgoths of Krea. During a recitation by their poet master, Grunthers the Flatulent, of his poem, Ode to a Small Lump of Green Putty I Found in My Armpit One Summer Morning, 4 of his audience died of internal hemorrhaging, and the president of the Mid-Galactic Arts Nobbing Council survived by gnawing one of his own legs off. Grunthos is reported to have been disappointed by the poem's reception and was about to embark on a reading of his 12-book epic entitled My favorite bath time gurgles. When his own major intestine, in a desperate attempt to save life and civilization, leapt straight up through his neck and throttled his brain. The very worst poetry of all perished along with its creator, Paul and Nancy Millstone Jennings of Greenbridge, Essex, England, in the destruction of the planet Earth. Prosthetic Wolfgang Jeltz smiled very slowly. This was not done not so much for effect as because he was trying to remember the sequence of muscle movements. He had a terribly therapeutic yell at his prisoners and was now feeling quite relaxed and ready for a little callousness. The prisoners sat in poetry appreciation chairs, strapped in. Vaughan suffered no illusions as to the regard their works were generally held in. Their early attempts at composition had been part of a bludgeoning insistence that they be accepted as properly evolved and cultured race. But now the only thing that kept them going was sheer bloody-mindedness. The sweat stood out cold on Ford Prefect's brow and slid around the electrodes strapped to his temples. They were attached to a battery of electronic equipment. Imagery intensifiers, rhythmic modulators, alliterative residuators, and simile dumplers were all designed to heighten the experience of the poem and make sure not a single nuance of the poet's thought was lost. Arthur Dent sat and quivered. He had no idea what he was in for, but he knew that he hadn't liked anything about what had happened so far, and he didn't think things were likely to change. The Vaughan began to read, a fetid little passage of his own devising.
Oh, Fredald Grunt-Bugley,
he began. Spasms racked Ford's body. This was worse than he'd been prepared for.
thy miturations are to me as plurdled glabble blotchets on a lugid bee.
Went Ford Prefect, wrenching his head back as lumps of pain thumped through it. He could dimly see beside him Arthur lolling and rolling in his seat. He clenched his teeth.
Gloop, I implore thee,
continued the merciless Vaughan,
my fluting turlingdromes.
His voice was rising to a horrible pitch of impassioned stridency.
And hopelessly drangled me with crinkly bindlewordles, or I will rend thee in the gobberwarts with my blurgle cruncheon, and see if I don't.
cried Ford Prefect, and threw one final spasm as the electronic enhancement of the last line caught him full blast across the temples. He went limp, and Arthur lolled.
Now, earthlings,
whirred the Vaughan. He didn't know that Ford Prefect was, in fact, from a small planet somewhere in the vicinity of Betelgeuse, and he wouldn't have cared if he had.
I present you with a simple choice. Either die in the vacuum of space,
he paused for melodramatic effect,
or tell me how good you thought my poem was.
He threw himself backward into a huge, leathery, bat-shaped seat, and he watched them. He did the smile again. Ford was rasping for breath. He rolled his dusky tongue around his parched mouth and moaned. And Arthur said brightly, "Actually, I quite liked it." Ford turned and gaped. Here was an approach that had simply not occurred to him. The Vogon raised a surprised eyebrow that effectively obscured his nose and was therefore no bad thing.
"Oh, good,"
he whirred in inconsiderable astonishment. "Oh, yes," said Arthur. "I thought that, some of the metaphysical imagery was really particularly effective." Ford continued to stare at him, organizing his thoughts around this totally new concept. Were they going to be able to bareface their way out of this?
"Yes, do continue,"
invited the Vogon. "Oh, and, interesting rhythmic devices, too," continued Arthur, "which seem to, counterpoint the, he floundered, and Ford leaped to his rescue, hazarding, "counterpoint the surrealism of the underlying metaphor of the, He floundered too, but Arthur was ready again. "The humanity of the vulgarity," Ford hissed at him. "Ah, yes, vulgarity, sorry, of the, poet's compassionate soul." Arthur felt like he was on the home stretch now, "which contrives through the medium of the verse structure to sublimate this, transcend that, and come to terms with the fundamental dichotomies of other—" He was reaching to a triumphant crescendo, "and one is left with a profound and vivid insight into—" Suddenly it gave out on him, and Ford leaped in with the coup de grace. "Into whatever the poem was about," he yelled out of the corner of his mouth.
"Well done, Arthur.
"Was very good." The Vogon perused them, and for a moment his embittered radical soul had been touched. But he thought, no, too little too late. His voice took on the quality of a cat snagging brushed nylon.
"So, what you're saying is that I write poetry because underneath my mean, callous, heartless exterior, I really just want to be loved,"
he said, and he paused.
"Is that right?"
Ford laughed a nervous laugh. "Well, I mean, yes," he said. "Don't we all, deep down, you know—" The Vogon stood up.
"No, well, you're completely wrong," he said. "I just write poetry to throw my mean, callous, heartless exterior into sharp relief. I'm going to throw you off the ship anyway. Guard, take the prisoners to the number 3 airlock and throw them out."
"What?" shouted Ford. A huge young Vogon guard stepped forward and yanked them out of their straps with his huge, blubbery arms. You can't throw us into space," yelled Ford. "We're trying to write a book."
"Resistance is useless,"
shouted the Vogon guard back at him. It was the first phrase he'd learned when he joined the Vogon Guard Corps. The captain watched with detached amusement and then turned away. Arthur stared round him wildly. "I don't want to die now," he yelled. "I've still got a headache. I don't want to go to heaven with a headache. I'd be all cross, and I wouldn't enjoy it." The guard grasped them firmly around the neck, and bowing deferentially toward his captain's back, hoiked them both protesting out of the bridge. A steel door closed, and the captain was on his own again. He hummed quietly and mused to himself, lightly fingering his notebook of verses. He said.
"Counterpoint the surrealism of the underlying metaphor."
He considered this for a moment, and then closed the book with a grim smile.
"Death is too good for them,"
he said.